Why do we say Kaddish for the dead? Yom Kippur, Yizkor 57:84. When we think about David, or David's sin, we think about his affair with Bathsheba and having his lover's husband killed. But David committed another sin as well, which becomes the basis of the supplicatory prayer, Tachanun. David takes a census of the people, and for this he's admonished by the Navi, by the prophet, God, not God, but God. Now you're probably asking yourself, what's the big deal? He's the king, he took a census. Governments need to know how many people they rule over so they can provide services. Micah Goodman, the Bible professor, explains that David wasn't taking a census for practical purposes. He was stroking his own ego. He wanted to see how many people he ruled over, and that he shouldn't have done. Similarly, it's one thing for a wealthy guy to figure out how much money he has so he can do financial planning. It's another thing just to count his money so he can glorify himself and stroke his ego. After David is confronted by God for the sin, he cries out, Chatati ma'od, my sin is great, I've messed up. He seems to be doing teshuvah. The first part of teshuvah is admitting that you've made a mistake. But he continues, Va'ata Hashem ha'aver na et avon avdecha ki niskalti ma'od. Please, O Lord, let my guilt ha'aver pass over your servant, pass over me, for I have acted foolishly. David is told he's going to get to pick the penalty he suffers. He has three choices. The first is the nation can suffer 7 years of famine. The second is he can spend 3 months being pursued by his enemies. The third is the nation can suffer 3 days of pestilence. David responds with the words which we now find in Tachanun. Vayomer David al Gad, Sarli ma'od, nipla na v'yad Hashem, ki rabim rachamav, v'yad Adam al epolah. David said to God, I am deeply distressed. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his compassion is great, but let me not fall into the hands of man. David deliberately did not choose the penalty of being pursued by his enemies because he would have had to bear the brunt of the punishment. Instead, he said, Ha'aver, pass it on, pass it over me to the people. Let the nation suffer on my behalf. Let them become my whipping boy. Nipla, let us fall, let the nation fall for my sins. And he chooses that the nation suffers pestilence. But then he sees 70,000 people die of the plague. And we're told, V'yichach lev David oto, that David's heart struck him. Perhaps this is the first case we ever see of Jewish guilt. He says, my God, what have I done? I sinned and now my people are suffering for my sin. He says, no, the buck stops here. I and I alone am guilty. At that point, God says, go and set up an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Aravna the Jebusite. This is the spot, this threshing floor, where eventually his son Shlomo would build the Bet HaMikdash, the temple, and according to Jewish tradition, this is also the spot where Avraham went to sacrifice Yitzhak during the Akedah. Why was the temple in the future to be built on this very spot? It's because David finally learned the message of the Akedah. Leaders shouldn't exploit their people, just as God forbade Abraham from exploiting Yitzhak as a korban, as a sacrifice. David now has finally learned this message as well. As the king, his job is to care for the people, not to exploit them. And now that he's learned that lesson, he could start laying the groundwork for what eventually would become the Bet HaMikdash, would become the temple. For leaders sacrifice on behalf of their people, not the other way around. Let me now share a modern story about sacrifice. Easy Eddie was Al Capone's lawyer. Not surprisingly, he was a dirty, crooked lawyer. But he was to have a son, and one day he had an epiphany. He said, my God, what type of role model am I going to be to my son, doing anything and everything just to make a buck? He decided to turn state's evidence and testify against Capone, but not surprisingly, he was killed in a hail of gunfire before he ever got to court. Did he sacrifice his life in vain? Let me tell you another story now about Butch, a naval pilot on the Lexington during World War II. He was in a squadron of 6 planes. They were flying off the Lexington, and he saw Japanese fighters coming in to attack the Lexington. Only he and his wingman stood between the Japanese fighters and the Lexington. His wingman's gun had jammed, so Butch himself flew directly into 9 Japanese fighters, scrambling them and shooting down 5 of them. He likely saved the Lexington and all the American sailors on that ship. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. It said it was one of the most daring, if not the most daring, acts in the history of combat aviation. Butch's last name is O'Hare, and as in O'Hare Airport in Chicago, and his father is Eddie, Easy Eddie O'Hare, the crooked mafia lawyer who did not die in vain. His teshuvah inspired his son's valor, which saved the lives of hundreds of American sailors. Easy Eddie reminds us that even if you can only do partial teshuvah, you should still do it. I mean, he wasn't able to do full teshuvah, Easy Eddie, because he had enabled a murderer to continue murdering. And obviously you can't make amends to people who have been killed because of your efforts or because you had a part in it. But nevertheless, his teshuvah, as I said, inspired his son's act, his heroic act, and because of that, hundreds of American lives were saved. We should learn from Easy Eddie that some teshuvah is better than none. And I am going to even argue that Easy Eddie was a better man than David's own son, Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. Now, I know that's a bold, chutzpahdik thing to say, but just hear me out here. Shlomo, as an older man, was admonished by a Navi, by a prophet, for engaging in idolatry. Remember, this is the man who had built the Bet HaMikdash temple, had become an idolater. So if a Navi, the prophet, comes to admonish him, you'd expect him to do teshuvah like his Abba, David, had done when he earlier on had been admonished by a prophet. But Shlomo didn't. In fact, he did absolutely nothing. He probably said, doing teshuvah is too much work, it's too late, and simply died an unrepentant sinner. Easy Eddie, on the other hand, despite the fact that he could never undo his sins, the fact that he never could do teshuvah gamara, complete teshuvah, still did what he could, and his efforts indirectly saved the lives of others. My friends, it's never too late to do teshuvah and to sacrifice, even to sacrifice on behalf of our dearly departed loved ones who, when they were in the land of the living, sacrificed on our behalf. By doing teshuvah, by sacrificing, we can repay them for what they did for us when they were in the land of the living. And we can start simply by saying Kaddish and saying Yizkor. The strange thing is, Kaddish, the Kaddish that we say on their behalf, has nothing to do with the dead. What's the connection? The Machzor Vitri, which is an early version of the Siddur from the 12th century, contains a story in response to the question of whether or not one can atone for a parent's sin. It says that Rabbi Akiva once saw what he thought was a man struggling with a heavy burden on his shoulders. Bemoaning his lot and what Rabbi Akiva thought was his life, concerned that this might be an overworked slave deserving to be freed, Rabbi Akiva asked the man for a story. The oppressed laborer replied that he was the soul of one who had committed every conceivable sin. The punishment of this sinner was to gather wood, for which was used to burn him every day. Rabbi Akiva asked if there was anything he could do for this soul to free him from his misery. The deceased replied the only way was if he had a son who would stand in front of the congregation and say, Baruch et Hashem hamvarach, blessed be Hashem, the blessed, the call to worship. Or perhaps, Yikadal v'Kadash Shemei Rabbah, exalted and sanctified be his great name, and the congregation would have to answer, Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mavarach Olam Olamei Olmaya. May his great name be blessed for eternity. In other words, the Kaddish. Finally, Rabbi Akiva asked the man if he had been survived by anyone. The spirit replied that his wife had been pregnant when he died. Rabbi Akiva recorded the deceased's name, where he was from, and went to the hometown of where the man was from. When he arrived at the hometown, he discovered that the deceased was particularly reviled by the people. He had been a venal, corrupt tax collector and even had violated a young woman on Yom Kippur. Rabbi Akiva located the widow who had given birth to the son. So despised was her husband that nobody had even circumcised the child. Rabbi Akiva, of course, took care of his omission, and when the child was old enough, he taught him Torah and how to daven in shul, including the prayers the man had specified, Baruch and Kaddish. As soon as the boy recited the appropriate prayers, his father's soul was relieved from its suffering, and the man then appeared to Rabbi Akiva and thanked him for relieving him from his suffering and the tortures of Gehenna, purgatory. The Machzor Vitri adds that the boy first said Kaddish on Motzei Shabbat, after Shabbat. Now, this should not come as a surprise, because the idea is that on Shabbat, even those in Gehenna get a break from their suffering. But when Shabbat ends, they resume suffering. So this man didn't have to go back to suffering after Shabbat ended. This time he got to go to Olam Haba, to the world to come, to heaven. The point is, by saying Kaddish and Yizkor, as well as performing other mitzvot, we can help our dearly departed loved ones ascend from one level of heaven to the next level of heaven. By doing mitzvot on their behalf, their neshamot, their souls, get an aliyah, they rise. The idea is that there's not one level of heaven. According to mystical thinking, there are 7 levels, and the mitzvot you do on their behalf help them arise to a higher level of heaven, receiving even more and more enjoyment. People say, may his or her neshama have an aliyah. It means may they arise to yet even higher level of heaven. So this year, let us sacrifice on behalf of our dearly departed loved ones, just as they sacrificed on our behalf. We sacrifice by continuing their work and coming to shul frequently to daven, to say Baruch and to say Kaddish, and to daven in general, and participating in all aspects of Jewish life. By doing so, you're not only honoring their memory and continuing their work, but you're also helping them to ascend to a higher level of Shemayim. Now that's a sacrifice worth making.